In this lesson, we'll go over the basics of designing an interface by creating a simple UI for updating a customer's credit limit in our sample database. Let's start by creating a new workspace and selecting the blank page template. We'll switch to the database, right-click Tables, and select Create Sample Database. This creates some sample data for us to work with. For this application, we're primarily concerned with customer data, which we can query or edit from the right-click menu. Now let's switch to widgets and design a simple interface. We'll use a panel and give it a title. A panel is a special type of widget called a layout. Layouts have one or more sections that contain and group other widgets. Now let's put a customer label, a credit limit label, and an update button into the panel. We can position and size the elements however we'd like. Okay, things are starting to shape up. Let's switch back to the database and expand the customers table. We'll switch our mode to input because we'll be adding input elements based on the database. Now drag customer number and credit limit to the UI. By default, they're both text boxes. We can change that right here in the canvas, or we can double-click the column in the database tree and change its widget type and other properties permanently in the database. For now, let's just go directly to our canvas and change the customer to a drop-down. In the Properties window, we can specify how to populate the drop-down. The drop-down data will come from the database. I can search individual properties, or I can find property sections by using a plus sign in front of my search. The section I'm looking for is called Database-Driven Selection. Not every property is required here. For example, we don't need to specify a database connection because our default database will work just fine. We'll pick the customer database table. For the options field, let's show customer name, but let's make sure to provide the customer number as the value. This is important because the customer number is the primary key, and it's best to use it when retrieving customer data. Our drop-down is all set. Now let's look at the credit limit text box. When you double-click it, a binding dialog for the text box value comes up. Here we can specify which database field controls the value and how the value should be displayed. For example, we can show the thousands separator, which is a comma character by default. Binding is an important concept in Profound.js. We can access the same binding dialog by going to the value property and clicking the binding icon. But value is not the only property that can be bound. In fact, most properties can become dynamic through binding. For example, if we wanted to control the text color based on some business logic, such as credit limit is greater than $50,000, we would bind the color property to a field name. Let's call it credit limit color and make it a string. Well, our interface looks pretty good now. Let's save, launch, and check it running. The customer list is displaying as expected in the drop-down. Our next step will be to implement the business logic to retrieve and update the credit limit. We'll cover that in our next lesson.